So I thank you for joining us today for the first installment for the 2021 year of our Contagion Culture Lecture Series that has been running very successfully since last July, showcasing various talent associated with Queen's University and organized through the School of Policy Studies. My name is Christian Leubrecht. I'm the director of the Institute of Intergovernmental Relations that's co-hosting today's event. So you'll see through 2021 more opportunities to feature a variety of people across the Faculty of Arts and Science working on policy-related materials. So let me welcome you to the webinar here. And I want to start by acknowledging the traditional territory on which Queen's University is located. For many thousands of years, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples have sought to walk gently on this land. And we seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, a relationship that is based in honor and deep respect. I want to welcome today our presenter, Kyle Hanneman, assistant professor in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University and a fellow of the Institute of Intergovernmental Relations. He completed his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and before coming to Queen's, he was a policy associate at the University of Toronto's Mowat Center, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto's Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance, and a visiting researcher at the European Union University Institute. His research interests include fiscal federalism and political economy, with a focus on government, bond markets, subnational fiscal policy, and inter-regional risk sharing and redistribution. And the paper that he's presenting today is entitled Strengthening Canada's Fiscal Resilience, the Challenge of Provincial Debt. And this is, of course, an issue that is, as we're about to find out, quite pressing, not just in Canada, but also elsewhere in the world. The issue of subnational debt, usually when we talk about debts and deficits, it tends to be at the national level and at the level of the central government. But as we're about to find out, there are significant and arguably much more pressing challenges at the sub-state level, in particular when we look at the Canadian Federation. So I'll leave it to Kyle, and while Kyle is giving his presentation, I invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to enter your questions or comments, and we will then capitalize on those during the question and answer period before finishing at 5 p.m. So Kyle Hanneman, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Christian. Thank you to the School of Policy Studies for inviting me to take part in the Contagion series. It's always an honor to take part in these events. Thank you again to Christian for the introduction and for agreeing to moderate, and thanks as well to Chris Cornish for organizing the event. So the title of today's talk is Strengthening Canada's Fiscal Resilience, the Challenge of Provincial Debt. And it's based in large part on a recent piece I wrote for the IRPP. It's also very similar to my recent contribution to the COVID governance white paper prepared by the SPS governance working group under the direction of Kathy Brock. The talk is less about the fiscal policy response to the crisis and more about the fiscal and governance challenges the Federation will face as we exit the crisis. So the period I have in mind is the post-vaccination or post-lockdown period, and I think that distinction is important to keep in mind. I'm going to look at the long-run implications of the crisis for provincial debts, and talk a little bit also about the longer-term trends and provincial finances. I'll also talk about the potential governance responses. And when I do that, I really want to focus on the national or fiscal federal dimensions of the problem. The questions I'll ask are two. The first is whether we should be concerned about the size and trajectory of provincial debt. That's a more controversial question than I think some might think. And if so, whether we can redesign our fiscal federal arrangements to put provincial finances on a more sustainable path. I'm going to argue that we shouldn't panic. Bigger debts have become a fact of life. and they're also more sustainable than they've ever been because of lower interest rates, but also some important structural changes in the economy. But we should be concerned. The provinces are not federal borrowers, and they have rather worrying debt dynamics and much larger fiscal risks than the federal government. So we need, I'm going to argue that we need to find a way of stabilizing provincial debt to GDP. And I think a lot of other people would like to do that while making sure other policy objectives, including provision of adequate social policy and infrastructure investment, are met. So satisfying these goals will likely require a significant increase in federal transfers, but that alone is not going to be enough. We also need to ensure that the additional transfers don't undermine incentives for provincial fiscal discipline. And that's a very difficult balance to strike, even in relatively centralized multi-level systems where the central government can impose or negotiate some sort of system of fiscal rules at the subnational level. So it's particularly daunting in a country like Canada, given the decentralized and fragmented nature of the federal society and institutions. I will, however, suggest a couple one possible governance response. It's the one that I discuss in the IRPP paper. But I'm going to close on a slightly pessimistic note and suggest that a more informal, incomplete, or ad hoc solution is the one that's likely to arise. And I think the solution is probably sustainable now and may continue to work well into the future. But I think it sets the provinces and thus the federation up for considerable fiscal and political risk. Okay, so to that first question, should we be concerned? Provincial debt levels are at record levels. They're significantly higher than they were pre-2008, pre-global financial crisis. The provinces are also running large deficits at the moment. Those deficits look relatively small compared to the federal government, but they are roughly 5% of GDP collectively right now, which is significantly higher than the deficits we saw after the global financial crisis. But the costs of carrying that debt are significantly lower than they have been in the past, particularly if we compare it to the situation in the 1990s. Provincial interest payments to GDP are well under 2%, or at least they were. Last time I checked, I think it's second quarter 2020. And they've been more or less flat. Those interest payments have been since the shock of 2008, despite the increase in provincial debt. So clearly, provinces can borrow more than they did in the 1990s. But the next obvious question is whether they should. And this is a harder question. So on the one hand, if we just talk about governments generally, there's no question that today's governments should borrow more and for longer, and not just because we're in the midst of a pandemic. Many believe COVID-19 has accelerated the trend of advanced economies toward a state of secular stagnation. That's an idea that first arose in the 1930s and was recently revived by Larry Summers. Business investment has been languishing for years, and the recent shock will only damage it further. And the upshot's likely to be a low growth, low inflation, low interest rate environment, likely to extend well beyond lockdowns or mass vaccination. And there's not much central banks can do about it. Interest rates are already at zero. Only fiscal authorities can provide the stimulus shocked economies need. And they're also under growing pressure to increase public investments as well. Borrowing is not without risks in this environment. That's not the argument sophisticated advocates of stimulus are making. Rather, it's that the bigger risk may be not doing enough. The structure of the economy has changed. It's not the 90s. And the balance of risks clearly recommends larger deficits and slower paths to fiscal consolidation. And that's not just the view of MMT. This is the view of Olivier Blanchard, Larry Summers, and other mainstream economies. It's also the view of the IMF. Indeed, the IMF recently warned advanced economies against repeating the mistakes of the global financial crisis. when stimulus was prematurely withdrawn in Europe and the United States. On the other hand, if we move from a question of governments more generally to look at provinces and perhaps subnational governments in general, it's not clear what role provinces should play. Provinces are not central government borrowers. Their bonds are less liquid or easy to trade on secondary markets. They're also less creditworthy. Excuse me, I just have to, I noticed I have to plug in my computer here. Sure, Chris will edit that out. Provinces are also less creditworthy. There's some possibility, however slight, they might default. Okay, so they pay a risk premium over the central government for that. And I know from my own research, which has involved a number of discussions with investors in provincial debt, that most bondholders don't think the federal government would let a province default. That was true before the pandemic. That's when those interviews took place. And I suspect it's even truer today. Those bailout expectations allow provinces to borrow at lower rates, but they never entirely close the gap between federal and provincial borrowing conditions. So a few implications follow from this. The first concerns liquidity, or the ability of provinces to borrow over the short term. The provincial sector is more vulnerable to financial shocks. Provincial bond spreads increase when global financial markets become unhinged and investors seek liquidity and safety in federal debt. Now, granted, provincial interest rates also tend to fall during these periods, like we saw, for example, this year, even if their bond spreads rise. But if the volatility of provincial spreads becomes too severe, it can become very difficult for provinces to price and issue debt, as we saw, for example, for brief periods during 2008, the global financial crisis, the commodity bust of 2015-16, and the stock market crashes of late 2018 and early this year. So that's there I'm talking about the issue of provincial liquidity and the ability of provinces to borrow over the short term or to roll over their debt. The second point concerns debt sustainability. Ottawa is in a much better position to stabilize its debt to GDP. Canada's long-run economic growth rate has exceeded the long-run interest rate on federal debt for much of the country's history. And in fact, that's more often been the case than not. And what does that mean? What it means is that the debt to GDP will fall even if a government runs modest deficits in perpetuity. And that is the norm among advanced industrial countries, historical norm. Now, most provincial economies have also been growing at rates exceeding their long-term borrowing costs. As a recent study by Trevor Tome and I for the finances of the nation has shown, there should be an op-ed on that study out that we wrote in the Financial Post. It should come out sometime this week. But not all provinces borrow on these terms. So the long-term interest rates in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, for example, exceeded their long-term growth rates over the 2006-2018 period. And the differential for Ontario and Quebec, in Ontario and Quebec accounted for roughly 2/3 of the provincial bond market in 2019, was essentially zero. So the interest rate essentially, the 10-year interest rate essentially equaled the growth rate over that period. The other thing we've shown, I think this is important, is that the province's growth to interest rate differentials have been far more volatile over the 2006 to 2018 period, particularly for oil-producing provinces. So that would be Newfoundland, Labrador, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And what this means is that provincial borrowers face far greater interest rate risk in addition to higher borrowing costs. And so they face greater risk of unfortunate debt dynamics or growth in long-term debts. Now, provincial vulnerability should not be exaggerated. Provinces are back in the bond market. It was a little bit touch and go for them in March, April, May. but the bond market has stabilized since. They're back to sort of their standard publicly syndicated deals. International investors are showing strong interest. Borrowing for the 2021 fiscal year is 89% complete. Last week, Ontario's 10-year borrowing rate was 1.46%. It would have been under 2% for Newfoundland and Labrador as well. As many of you know, they had some of the more severe difficulties borrowing in the early part of 2020. Newfoundland and Labrador has also done 93% of its borrowing for this fiscal year. Provinces also benefit from the federal government's many and varied fiscal supports. Some of those direct additional transfers that they've received. Some are indirect. So the support that the federal government provides to firms and individuals have helped keep a floor under the Canadian economy and supported provincial finances in turn. And as of April 2020, the Bank of Canada's been purchasing provincial debt, meaning these historically, the sort of historically brief liquidity shocks that we saw, for example, in 2008 or the early part of this year may become even briefer. But central banks' interventions are primarily liquidity, not solvency devices. They're not really dealing with the long-term problem. And provincial borrowing capacity stems in part, as I noted, from investors' bailout expectations. Now, those beliefs lower spreads in the short term, but they encourage more borrowing in the end, and they could slowly chip away at Ottawa's credit standing over the long run. So in short, provinces can and should borrow more than they did in the 1990s, but their debts are uncomfortably high given the sector's vulnerabilities and the national risks. So the next question is, what should we do to stabilize them? So the answer to that question depends on the sources of provincial deficits. Many believe it's what federal scholars call the vertical fiscal imbalance. The provinces are responsible for healthcare and other open-ended expenditures, while the federal government enjoys a more flexible set of spending responsibilities and a disproportionate share of the revenue-raising capacity. A natural solution, therefore, is to transfer a larger share of federal revenues to the provincial level. That might include one-off transfers to help provinces with the pandemic and the economic recovery. It could include larger and perhaps a needs-based Canada Health transfer, particularly to help provinces with aging populations. It could also mean enhancements to the Fiscal Stabilization program or other programs designed to deal with provincial short-term revenue shocks. We've already seen the federal government raise the caps on those payments. But there's no guarantee additional transfers would work as a debt stabilization method. In fact, cross-national evidence suggests increasing transfers often increases deficits, particularly if it shields borrowers from irresponsible choices. Now, Ottawa can mitigate that sort of moral hazard risk, as it usually does, by allocating transfers according to clear, fixed, rules-based criteria. But these are mitigating measures, and they don't always solve the problem completely. And obviously, the pressure now for bailouts and ad hoc responses will be intense. So higher transfers may increase provinces' capacity to balance the books. Their incentives may be another matter. Another possibility is combining additional transfers with national fiscal rules or borrowing constraints. And it's not uncommon to find something like this in other federations, and especially unitary countries, particularly where an implicit bailout guarantee is present. But it's unlikely to fly in Canada, and I think the reasons are pretty well known. It's a deeply federal society, powerful provincial governments. A conditional bailout would be met with about as much enthusiasm as an intervention from the IMF. We also don't have the integrated party system and other institutions that other federations have to help territorial units resolve these very difficult distributional conflicts. I would say our capacity for collective action on this and other fronts is low. Now, That might not matter if a province has a prolonged debt crisis. They would arguably have to accept Ottawa's dictates, or they would be forced to default. But thankfully, that scenario is unlikely to arise. Saskatchewan, for example, flirted with default very briefly in 1993, but it quickly turned it around. First with a small and unconditional bailout from Ottawa, which allowed it to maintain its investment credit rating and to roll over its debts in turn. And then by a series of austerity measures that were motivated in part by the fear of requiring a larger and thus likely conditional level of federal support. Now that, I think, is a natural response in a country that avoids centralization at all costs. The province basically says, we're struggling, we're on the brink, is there something you can do? The federal government has no interest in seeing a province default, says, sure, we'll help a bit, but we don't want you to become dependent, so we'll just do enough to see it through. And the province is fine with us. We don't want you telling us what to do with our money anyway. So we'll take this little bit, and we'll pull up our bootstraps from here. And that's how I basically interpret the Saskatchewan response of the 1990s. It's a natural response, I think, but it's also sort of ad hoc response. I think ideally we would like to avoid. So how do we get ahead of the problem of provincial debt and avoid a situation like this in the future? One possibility, and one I discussed in the IRPP paper that I referenced at the top, is the establishment of a conditional bailout facility to lend at federal rates. If established soon, it could lend unconditionally until the economic recovery is underway. Beyond that, it could require recipients to commit to a fiscal consolidation plan. If launched with, and I think this is important, if it's launched with, if the facility is launched with an expanded set of federal transfers, I think the message would be clear. Ottawa is available to assist provinces, but there are limits to that support and no free bailouts for provinces that fail to live within them, live within the support. Now, consolidation plans would imply loss of provincial autonomy, but the use of the facility would be voluntary. And the hope is that no province ever has to use it. Perhaps the stigma of application alone might enhance incentives for fiscal discipline. Now, none of this would be easy. Fiscal rules would have to be robust enough to stabilize provincial debt. They would also have to be general and flexible. The fiscal rules associated with consolidation plans would have to be robust enough to stabilize that province's debt. They would also have to be general and flexible enough to protect provincial autonomy, accommodate swings in business cycles, and ensure adequate levels of public investment. We would also need to monitor compliance and commit federal and provincial governments to these plans. Now, these are daunting, very daunting collective action problems, even for relatively centralized multi-level systems. And we may decide our highly fragmented and contested model isn't up to the task. And if I'm being honest with myself, I think we probably will. A more likely development, in my view, is a version of the ad hoc approach Ottawa took with Saskatchewan in the 1990s. Provinces may have occasional difficulties borrowing, or they may simply face worrying increases in debt to GDP, even if they're not necessarily on the brink. The feds may help, but just enough to prevent the situation from getting out of control. This time, however, it may play out in a low interest rate environment and possibly with the central bank's bond buying support. So provinces should be able to survive or operate in this environment for some time, but debts of many will grow steadily, putting them at considerable fiscal risk if we see a sudden change in the macroeconomic environment. And putting off what we really need to do, which is find a viable way of bolstering and reconciling provincial fiscal capacity and discipline over the long term. So that's my talk. I finished up a bit early, but look forward to your questions.
So, Carl, it's fantastically interesting. Uh, Let me start with a couple of questions. So, one of the things that I heard you say is is it sort of akin to the European stability mechanism or the European financial stability facility as a sort of preventive mechanism to basically set up the rules for the bailout before you get yourself into a crisis? And so that will also calm the debt markets then, and because everybody has better predictability. And what would be the moral hazard in Canada with setting something like that up on basically an interprovincial federal sort of level?
Well, okay, so there's 2 points I want to address with that question, which is a good one. It does resemble that facility in a number of ways, but I'm always very anxious to distinguish that facility but from the kind of thing I have in mind. I think it's important to realize that the conditional support that provinces would receive under this IRPP scheme would be provided in the context of a broader fiscal union, where the federal government is providing provinces with a very robust set of fiscal federal supports to help ensure their long-term debt sustainability. And ideally, if they launch something like this, they would launch it with an increase in federal transfers. So it would be a much friendlier version of the European model, in a sense that it would not strictly be some sort of austerity generating approach. The other thing I'd quickly say about your point of moral hazard, it's true that it could potentially send a signal to bond markets that the federal government is unlikely to get provincial debts under control. But I think the thing to keep in mind is that theoretically, at least, it would be combined with a requirement for fiscal consolidation for the recipients. And also concerns about provinces who haven't accessed the fund about the potential need to apply to it. I assume that there's a very strong stigma attached to having to go to the federal government for these sorts of things. So that might help mitigate some of these moral hazard concerns.
So ask two other questions, and then I'll let sort of the audience get in. One is a question with regards to demographic change, and that, of course, the structural conditions in certain provinces, especially once you start going east from Ontario, and especially when you get out into the Atlantic provinces, there are people who argue that demographically these are unsustainable trends in the medium term fiscally. And so that arguably, no matter sort of what mechanism we come up with, it's going to have to be a fundamentally new and different arrangement, and possibly an even more asymmetric arrangement than we currently have, if certain smaller provinces with lower fiscal capacity are to be able to maintain their provincial decision-making autonomy that they technically enjoy under the Constitution, but that inherently, of course, any bailout or any active federal intervention would necessarily end up curtailing.
Yeah. So this is tough. I mean, I've been hearing this kind of argument a bit, right, where it's just sort of inevitable the federal government is going to have to come in and help provinces deal with these fiscal challenges related to demographics. Like we're going to get to that point. And when they are when they do get involved, it may result in a more asymmetric set of transfer arrangements across provinces. It may result in greater fiscal dependence on the central government, and that could have some implications for autonomy. Just a couple quick points. I think probably the federal government is going to have to get involved, more involved on account of that. There is one. You mentioned the point about revenue raising capacity, and what's been kind of interesting in recent years is that since 2015, with the shock to commodity prices, there's been a very significant convergence of fiscal capacity across provinces. And that convergence has been accelerated by the pandemic. Alberta still has above average fiscal capacity, but it doesn't look nearly as special as it used to be. So in terms of revenue raising capacity, there seems to be a fairly significant amount of convergence, even though there are still some important gaps. On the other hand, I think going forward, you're going to see a lot more variability in terms of the needs of provinces, the fiscal needs, as opposed to the revenue raising capacity, because they're facing different sets of demographic challenges, and so one possibility might be, in addition to enhancing the Canada Health Transfer, you build in a needs-based component to reflect some of that variation. So you would have asymmetry under that, but at least there would be a formula associated with it. You could do something similar with the equalization system, build in a needs-based component. They have something like that in places like Australia, in Switzerland. I think probably politically that's a less viable option, but it could be something to consider.
And my last question for you before we'll go to the audience is, and you already sort of alluded to this, there are, of course, other countries that do this differently. In the US, there is no systematic system. In Australia, you have the Commonwealth Grants Commission. In Germany, you essentially have a value-added tax-based mechanism with additional transfers that provides for more predictability and I guess a less political mechanism, so that the classic question in comparative federalism is, of course, there's many different ways that you can skin the cat in terms of how do we deal with the vertical revenue raising capacity that basically plagues just about every federation around the world. And in Canada, we rely to a far greater extent on provincial autonomous revenue raising capacity than most other federations. So is the trends that you're seeing going to essentially drive us or even railroad us into a situation where the current arrangement is simply going to become unsustainable because it is going to become so politicized at both the provincial and the federal level that we're going to have to devise a different type of mechanism to ensure the sustainability of the fiscal federation, the medium-term future sustainability, fiscal sustainability of the federation?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a point I was trying to address toward the end of the presentation. Just to talk briefly, about the countries you mentioned. United States, there isn't this assumption of an implicit bailout guarantee, and state debts. That's probably one of the main reasons state debts are so low. The states also have most of them have some form of balanced budget legislation in place, but that's arguably a historical function of the lack of implicit bailout guarantee. They have more robust fiscal rules that they've imposed on themselves because they needed them in order to have any sort of credibility with bond markets. Now, they have lower debts, but they have other sorts of problems. I mean, I think the big problem in the United States is the tendency of states to counteract the countercyclical measures at the federal level when they're hit with a crisis. You saw this in 2008. Paul Krugman referred to them as 50 deficit slashing Herbert Hoovers who undermined a big part of the multiplier effect from the federal stimulus, and we see the same problems playing out today during the pandemic. So there's less ability for them to borrow in crisis and prevent that tension with macroeconomic policy at the national level, but there's very severe economic and fiscal consequences. And so another way to look at this is that the implicit bailout guarantee is not all bad. If it helps us generate the sort of fiscal response that we need in downturns, then it has some positives as well. Germany, in some ways, I had the German system in mind when I was thinking about how to reconcile a more generous set of fiscal transfers with sort of a set of national rules. There's a German debt break in place that's binding on state governments. That's been suspended during the pandemic, but presumably it'll be back in force again. And I think that that's a federation that, while many would argue that the Germans are a little bit too austere, when they're hit with fiscal shocks, I think that's a federation that's done a pretty good job of reconciling fiscal solidarity among territorial units with fiscal discipline. But sorry, to get to your real question about whether we're going to be forced into some sort of fundamental transformation of the federal system. I don't think so. I think that the Saskatchewan example in the 90s is telling. I think that there's tremendous reluctance to centralize. I think that provinces will do everything in their power to avoid it, including taking some fairly significant austerity measures. And it's not inconceivable for provinces to do that if they think it's necessary for them to protect their autonomy. But again, this sort of dynamic I think is playing out in a lower interest rate environment. And because of some of the structural developments in the economy that I highlighted towards the start of the talk, I think that those low rates are likely to persist for some time. We also that hasn't always prevented provinces from experiencing, difficulties in bond markets, but now we have central bank supports to try to see them through those rough patches. None of this is a long-term solution, but I think as the Europeans have shown in recent years, this low rate environment with central bank supports, and in Canada you can add on the federal supports and the likely ad hoc bailouts that we could also use to just sort of keep kicking the can down the road. I think there's potential for this to go on for some time, but I want to be very careful about those sorts of predictions. I'm really I don't think I have any great power to predict what's going to happen with these matters.
I'll take up the questions from the audience. I'll start with sort of what I think might be the easier ones to get you warmed up, and then we'll get to the really hard ones there. So the first couple of questions. So the difference between a debt and a deficit, if you could explain that, how transferring funds from the feds to the provinces increases the debt in provinces, and whether territories have the same ability to borrow as provinces do.
So the difference between a deficit and debt. So deficit is basically your shortfall for the year, to put it in the simplest terms, and those things can accumulate and eventually and add to your debt. So debt is the stock that you get from adding up those annual deficits. Now this question about how is it that transfers could potentially increase federal deficits. Now, on the one hand, that seems kind of counterintuitive because it does bolster provincial fiscal capacity and the ability to pay for their expenditures. But that's a sort of a mechanical way of looking at how it plays out. What you really have to be conscious of is how it affects provincial behavior. There's a large literature, comparative fiscal federalism literature, that suggests that increasing deficits, particularly with their ad hoc deficits that the central government provides to help governments out of jams that they created, then this can signal to them that their debts are basically backed or guaranteed by the central government. And if they're operating under that assumption, they'll run up unsustainable deficits under the assumption that the federal government will ultimately bail them out. Now, this can also sort of play out in credit market or bond markets. Bond markets may observe this too and say, hey, the federal government just keeps bailing provinces out. I guess we don't really have to charge much of a risk premium. And so even though, and that can occur even if provinces don't assume they'll get bailed up by the federal government. They just find themselves in a situation where it's far easier for them to borrow and amass unsustainable debts than it should be, given their provincial capacity to repay them. I think that it's often difficult to identify the causes of increasing transfers on provincial fiscal behavior. And I want to emphasize that there are ways to design transfers to mitigate those effects. Like, for example, if you design it according to the clear fixed criteria that have nothing to do with the decisions provinces make. So a fiscal stabilization program, for example, if provinces, provincial revenues are hit with a big shock that they couldn't possibly have engineered by themselves, then they get some support from the federal government. And you can, just to make the comparison straightforward, imagine the federal government increased transfers every time provinces ran a deficit. Well, that would clearly create a very negative incentive for provinces. I should go back, though, to the fiscal stabilization program example, because I think it illustrates sometimes how difficult it could be to design these rules. Like, even if you try to set it up so that the federal supports respond to these exogenous or external criteria that aren't directly linked to provincial behavior, provinces may nonetheless adopt more risky fiscal positions over the long term, because they know if there's a big hit coming, they can get support. So I think all this, I'm glad the question was asked, because it offers an opportunity to sort of reinforce this point that it's often very difficult to figure out ways for the federal government to boost provincial fiscal capacity while making sure incentives for discipline and balance are still present.
Here's a question that I think will be on many people's mind. And it's also sort of a classic Canadian question about whether one way to resolve the tax problems is by having the federal government vacate some fiscal room, and in particular to do this through the value-added tax, and simply to transfer either sort of a couple of pare back your GST by a couple of points. And of course, I think a lot of people were surprised that the provinces didn't take up the opportunity to occupy that fiscal room. Or if we go back to, I think, 1977, if I'm correct, when the federal government transferred fiscal points to the provinces, but then quickly realized they're never going to do that again because they don't get any credit for doing so. Any reactions to that?
It is another way to deal with a vertical fiscal imbalance. It's not one I tend to support for a couple different reasons. One, I'm a bit of a social democrat. That may seem unlikely given my concerns about provincial debts. I don't actually worry so much about the debt of advanced economies in general. I just think that there's greater risks of carrying it at the subnational level. So anytime you start transferring those tax points, you transfer them to units with varying degrees of fiscal capacity, and thus varying capacities to support things like healthcare and education or so forth. So I think there's a strong equity argument against it. I also the other thing to note, I think that to go to your point earlier, Christian, about this issue of provinces, we might get to the situation where they are going to be more dependent on the federal government because of some of these very severe demographic challenges, and I think that this doesn't strike me as a particularly um, effective way of trying to stabilize the debts of provinces dealing with those challenges, in particular, given the low fiscal capacity and needs of certain provinces. The other thing here too is that it might. Well, I think I'll just leave it at that.
Two questions with regards to the Bank of Canada. So one is, how does the Bank of Canada decide to apportion among provinces its purchase of provincial debt? And the other is whether you think that the Bank of Canada should continue its easing program, and whether this is a variation on the soft budget constraint problem.
Okay, so I will, I just want to be careful about I am a political scientist, so I want to be careful about my responses to this. Now, the Bank of Canada, the purchase of provincial debt are based on two criteria. One is the proportion of provincial GDP, and I believe the other is the level of outstanding debt. Now, the GDP, you can see why that they would use GDP. It's a way, it's sort of a neutral way of doing it. One that might avoid concerns, at least some concerns with moral hazard. Christian, can you remind me of the second part of the question?
So the apportionment among provinces for the Bank of Canada of buying up debt, whether the Bank of Canada should continue sort of its easing program, and whether this is really just a variation on the soft budget constraint problem.
Okay, so this is the part of the question I want to be careful about because I'm not an economist. I think most economists at this point think that quantitative easing makes sense in this context. It's a low rate environment, and this is the obvious way for the central bank to provide support. But I'm not particularly concerned about the moral hazard thing. I think anytime you have a situation like this, there is some sort of risk of moral hazard, but that doesn't mean. But there are trade-offs, right? If you don't do it, there's a cost. If you do it, there could be a long-term issue of moral hazard. At the federal level, again, I worry less about this. I think we can have debates about whether we got the right size, the federal deficit's the right size, whether we're spending on the right things. But I'm not particularly concerned with the federal response to this crisis. I do worry more about provincial governments. I think they operate under stronger budget constraints, and they have to be more careful as a result. And I do think that central bank interventions do have the potential to create that moral hazard problem. That does not mean, however, that we should not go ahead and do it. Like if you look back at the situation that started all this in March and April, provinces were having an extraordinary difficult time borrowing. And I looked at it's at one point that Newfoundland and Labrador was going to run out of cash. And I wrote a piece in the Financial Post at that time suggesting the federal government should get in and start buying provincial debt, because the name of the game at that time was ensuring everybody was liquid, so we could at least create some sort of floor under demand. We were going to keep households liquid. We were going to keep firms liquid, but we also needed to keep provinces liquid because they were on the front lines of fighting this healthcare crisis. So just like in the Eurozone, you kind of had to go in and you do it. And then, when you start to come out of it and things start to stabilize and you start withdrawing these supports, and I'm not sure they'll ever fully get withdrawn. But that's the time when you got to start figuring out what you're going to do with the moral hazard that may have caused, in my view.
I'll tie two questions together here. One is whether there's nuances in the way provinces versus territories can borrow. So in particular, I directed sort of the question with regards to territorial ability to borrow. And the other is the role of municipal finances and to what extent given their much more limited capacity for borrowing, that should factor into fiscal consolidation.
Yeah. So territories, I don't know a tremendous amount about them, so I won't say too much. They do some bond issuance, but it's considerably less. And there's some very stark differences between borrowing at the provincial and municipal level. Provinces aren't constrained in any sense by the federal government, but borrowing conditions of municipalities are subject to very strict provincial rules. There's only so much they can borrow. They can only borrow for certain purposes. For example, they can only borrow to invest in infrastructure, whereas provinces can invest in operations. They're required to balance their budget, so they don't do a lot of debt refinancing and rolling over debt. Which provinces do a lot of. There was, I haven't been following the municipal situation closely. I think there was some easing of borrowing conditions in a couple of provinces to help them generate some of the cash they needed to deal with the crisis. But there are very clear differences in terms of the ability of provinces and municipal governments to borrow.
And I'll finish on tying two other questions together, whether this de facto sort of amounts to a modern monetary theory and whether that sort of necessitates a complete redesign of our tax system, and then also why mainstream economists don't see sort of current debt loads as concerning, whether that's because of current low interest rates, and why can we be confident that they will actually remain low? So we just have a couple of minutes left, so maybe you can just quickly weigh in on those items.
Sure, Christian. The MMT. Does this amount? So does this amount to MMT? Like, it was a particular point that I made that they were.
The question is, are we de facto in a modern monetary theory era, and do we need to redesign our entire taxation system in response?
No. Well, I mean, the conclusion, the policy conclusion that we should run very large deficits is a conclusion you could come to through a post-Keynesian, or secular stagnation framework, or even a new Keynesian framework without needing to resort to MMT. If you want to, think of it in terms of new Keynesian model, just looking at it from a policy perspective, I think the key thing to know is that, new Keynesians, if the economy falls below potential, you can deal with that by slashing interest rates or running deficits. But as long as central banks have some kind of interest rate to cut, then that's the way to go. It's a more effective tool in their view, both from a political and technical point of view. But if you're up against a zero lower bound and you have no way to pull the economy out of a funk, then you have to rely on more aggressive fiscal measures. That's not MMT. That's just straight up plain economics, and it's the kind of argument that you're going to find a lot of mainstream economists making. I think that the one sort of problem I have with MMT, Paul Krugman's made this point a few times now, where he says theoretical foundations of MMT and mainstream economics are quite distinct, but they come to the same basic policy conclusions when interest rates are up against a zero lower bound. So he would prefer not to argue with them at the moment, because they're sort of on board with each other politically. MMT is MMT to me feels kind of harmless in the moment. As we start to come out of this and the economy starts to stabilize, and we have to start thinking seriously about fiscal stabilization, MMT makes me a little bit nervous because I don't think it really recognizes a budget constraint. And that bothers me because I think there is a long-term budget constraint, even if it's, for all intents and purposes right now, it's non-existent. It will reemerge. But I also think it's very difficult to make rational economic or fiscal decisions if you don't think that there's some kind of budget constraint present. If you don't recognize scarcity, how do you figure out the best things to spend money on, the best types of taxes to raise? Christian, I've forgotten the question again.
Well, the other question was simply with regards to the why mainstream economists don't see the current sort of debt loads as problematic, and whether that's sort of just because of low interest rates, and how is it that we can sort of anticipate that they're going to stay low. So I think that's a big question. So I'll just, maybe just in 30 seconds or a minute or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So interest rates are likely to stay low. There's a secular stagnation argument for that. There's a boom bust financial cycle argument for that I didn't get into. There are some big, essentially at the end of the day, demand is weak. There are a number of long-term structural forces behind that, growing levels of inequality, poor productivity gains, aging populations are actually keeping interest rates low. And so it's not that these economists don't recognize the risk of a sudden spike in interest rates or some spike in inflation, which would make these fiscal positions unsustainable. They do. But they also see an economy with incredibly depressed demand, and they believe that if we don't try to support that demand, that there could be some very severe scarring on the economy and labor force, and it could undermine the potential of the economy in the long term. And so that's why, on balance, they think we should go pretty hard on the deficits, at least for now.
So I think let me close out here so that we can finish in good time. I want to thank you. What I think was a absolutely fantastic and terrific discussion, both on the depth of your technical knowledge as well as the breadth of your understanding of different systems and the political dynamics of the Canadian system. It's been extremely informative for me, and I think this is contributes a lot to having a more informed discussion, which would probably help dial down the heat somewhat in the Federation if we could all sort of put some of the politics away and actually try to inject a bit more information into the overall level of discussions about fiscal federalism in general, equalization, debts and deficits, and as well as the horizontal and vertical fiscal inequalities and how we set ourselves up for success and sustainability in the future. So I really appreciate the time that you took today. For next week, the Contagion Culture Lecture Series will be hosting James Miller from Kunshan University, formerly at Queen's, on responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, perspectives from a Sino-US joint venture university. And because of the time change, that talk will be next Tuesday, but it will be at 8 a.m. I also remind you that if you've missed any of the previous previous talks in this series, this is now number 24. So there's 23 more that you can enjoy. You will find them on the YouTube channel of the School of Policy Studies, which you can link to from the School of Policy Studies website. I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank you for your loyalty to this lecture series, as well as your interest in the programming of the School of Policy Studies and of Queen's University's engagements with these important matters of public policy, constructive engagement. And on behalf of the Institute of Intergovernmental Relations and the School of Policy Studies, thank you very much for joining us today. We'll see you next Tuesday at 8 a.m.
I'd just like to thank you, Christian, and I'd like to thank the audience for the great questions. Okay, take care.